All right, my friends, today we are going to finish the book, If You Traveled West in a Covered Wagon. So the next question is, would you see any wild animals? I bet you can answer that question. Absolutely. The biggest animal that you would see would be a buffalo. If a herd came near the wagon train, you might see hundreds and hundreds at one time. They would run close together and kick up a lot of dust. You could feel the earth shaking as they went by. One young woman named Helen Carpenter traveled west in a covered wagon and wrote down what she saw. She wrote that when an old buffalo was shot and fell on its side, it was so big that you couldn't see the head of the 9-year-old boy standing behind it. You would also see prairie dogs. They were very interesting to watch because they lived in prairie dog cities. At least that's what it looked like. A lot of doorway holes in mounds all over the ground. When you came near a prairie dog city, you knew it right away. The prairie dogs would sit outside their doorways on their hind legs and watch you. And there, the buffalo. If you came too close, they would run inside. It seemed as if they were curious about who you were, but they didn't really want to meet any strangers. Wherever there were prairie dogs, there were rattlesnakes and owls. They seemed to be next-door neighbors, but they were not always friendly. Sometimes a rattlesnake or an owl would catch a prairie dog and eat it. You would also see or hear other wild animals. At night, if you heard a chorus of howls, it could be wolves or coyotes. And in the daytime, you might see jackrabbits, wild turkeys, sage hens, and lizards. You would probably see an antelope running, but if you didn't look quick, it might be gone. That's because they are very fast runners. If you think of mosquitoes as wild animals, then you would see and feel a lot of them. So there's those little prairie dogs, and then the owl and the rattlesnake. Could you send a letter or receive one? Back in the 1840s, there were no post offices west of the Mississippi River, so it wasn't easy to send or receive a letter. But there were a few ways that you could do it. Sometimes people would send letters to you at a fort on the trail. Some supply wagons going west would carry the letter to the fort and leave it there for you to pick up. At the forts, you might be able to leave a letter, which another wagon train would carry back home for you. In some places, you were charged money to send a letter, and in some places, you were charged money to receive one. Today, of course, only the sender of the letter pays money for the stamps. There were no envelopes for letters in those days. You would fold the letter up and drip some melted wax on the edge. When the wax cooled and hardened, the letter could not be opened until you broke the wax. That way you would know that nobody had read your letter. There was no television or radio back in the days of the covered wagons. People learned about what was going on in the world from reading newspapers, magazines, and letters. Before there were big cities in the West, all the newspapers and magazines came from the East. They had to be mailed out west, just like letters. By the time you got all the way to Oregon, it might take 2 years for a letter to get to you. And it could take just as long for a newspaper to get all the way out west. You might not know who was the president of the United States until 2 years after the election. Can you imagine that? So they drip some wax on there and let it harden. And a lot of times people had little decorations they would stamp on the wax. If you ran out of supplies, could you get more? Sometimes. Along the trail, there were a number of forts where the wagon trains would stop. You would usually stay over at a fort for a few days to rest up. It was also a chance to let the oxen, horses, and cows have a rest. If you left Independence, Missouri, the first big fort you would reach was Fort Laramie. It took about 40 days to reach the fort. Most wagon trains got there at the end of June. There were lots of things to do when you got to Fort Laramie. It was a time to fix the wagons, do the laundry, and buy or trade for new supplies. Usually, there were Indians at the fort. They set up their tents, which were called teepees, outside the walls of the fort and traded with people at the fort. The pioneers wanted to buy sugar, flour, coffee, cloth, leather, and other things they had run out of. Sometimes the fort had extra supplies, but sometimes a wagon train had arrived just before you and bought just about everything. You would be out of luck then. It might take you almost 30 more days to get to the next fort, called Fort Bridger. This fort was named after a man called Jim Bridger, who was an early fur and trader and trapper. He helped guide some trains west. Another fort before you reached Oregon was Fort Hall. From there, you traveled west and north to Oregon. Some pioneers left the Oregon Trail at Fort Hall and went south and west to California instead. On either trip, you would still have to travel at least 2 more months. Was it hard driving the wagon over the mountains? Yes. Some of the mountains were very high. You might have to borrow your neighbor's oxen to help pull your wagon up the high mountain. It would take a long time to get up the mountain this way. When you got to the top, the oxen had to be untied and sent down to help the next wagon. Those poor oxen had to go up and down and up and down and up and down. Yikes. You also had to be very careful going down steep mountains. The pioneers had poles through the wheels to keep them from turning and rolling too fast. They would also tie one end of a rope to the back of the wagon and tie the other end around a tree or a rock at the top of the mountain. If you loosened the rope at the top very slowly, you could keep the wagon from racing down the hill. The heavier wagons, the heavier the wagons, the harder it was to cross the mountains. So often you would see chairs or tables or boxes that people had left behind on the trail to lighten their load. We know that about Mama stuff, huh? Sometimes the pioneers even had to cut their wagons down so that they were left with a cart that only had 2 wheels. What the Saggers had to do. It was easier to take a 2-wheeled cart over some mountains than a whole wagon. You just hoped that it wouldn't happen to your wagon. So these big steep hills, they had to be very careful. They didn't have brakes, so they had to be really careful on how they were going to get their wagons down those steep hills. Without road signs, how would you know where you were? It wasn't always easy. It may be hard to imagine that you could get lost, but out on the open prairie, everything looked the same. Huge fields of waving grass. One pioneer wrote that everybody was so turned around that they were uncertain which was the right way to go. Sometimes you got help from trees or rocks or water holes. In places on the trail where there were big rocks with funny shapes, or water that looked and tasted unusual, or trees that were bent in strange ways. The early fur trappers and traders who had gone west had given names to many of these things. So when the pioneers traveled in their covered wagons, they looked for these landmarks. When you saw one, you knew you were going in the right direction. You also knew how far you had come. One famous landmark is called Chimney Rock. It was a tall column sitting on a bed of rock and rose about 500 feet from the ground into the air, about 40 stories high. You can probably guess why it was called that name. When you reached Chimney Rock, you had traveled some 550 miles from Independence, Missouri. Another famous landmark was Independence Rock. Some people say that it got its name because early travelers reached it on July 4th and celebrated Independence Day there. It was a great rock shaped like a turtle's back, and you could see it from far away. Independence Rock was a favorite place to climb. You also knew who had traveled there before you because many people carved or painted their names onto the rock. In one spot, a whole wagon train joined together and painted the Oregon Company, 1843, on the rock. Children loved one landmark called Soda Springs. It had bubbling water that you could drink. When you bent your head near the water, the bubbles tickled your nose. And there was a place called Steamboat Springs. Here, water came rushing up 2 to 3 feet in the air from cracks in the rock. It was blowing, splashing, and spraying, whizzing and sizzling, and making the puff-puff sound of a steamboat. There was also a very scary landmark called Jesse Applegate, called Devil's Backbone. If you think about how narrow your backbone is, you will understand why this place would be a place you would never forget. When Jesse's wagon train reached Devil's Backbone in 1843, the trail was very narrow. On the left side, the cliff went down about 1,000 feet. On the right side, it was worse. The cliff went all the way down to the Snake River, which seemed about a mile down. A mile is about 5,280 feet. At some spots on the Devil's Backbone, there was room for not much more than the wagon. Then everybody got out and walked in front and behind the wagons until the trail got wider. If you travel west today, you can see all of these places yourself. So there's Devil's Backbone. Do you see how narrow it is? Got the river on one side. It was very, very narrow. I could barely make it across there. What is the Continental Divide? If you drew an imaginary line along the top of the Rocky Mountains from the north to the south, you would have drawn the Continental Divide. This is the place in the United States where the great rivers flow in different directions. On the west side, all the rivers flow toward the Pacific Ocean. On the east side, they flow toward the Atlantic Ocean. The wagons crossed the Continental Divide at a place called South Pass. It was an opening in the mountains that was so wide it didn't seem as if you had crossed anything very important. Then you reached a spot called Pacific Springs. There you could watch the first waters on your trip flowing west. You knew you were at least halfway to Oregon. What special tricks of the trail did the pioneers learn? When you lived for 5 or 6 months in a covered wagon, traveling almost every day, you had to learn or invent new ways to do things. Here's a problem the pioneers had to solve. What could you do when the oxen's feet got sore? If you got tired from walking and your feet were very sore, you could climb up into the wagon and ride for a while. But what were the oxen supposed to do? The pioneers learned a trick from the Indians. First, you cut a small piece of animal skin. Then you make small holes all around the edges and put a string or narrow strip of leather through the holes to make a drawstring. You then put the side with the hair around the ox's foot and pull the string up tight and tie it like a shoelace. After 2 days of wearing these moccasins, the ox's feet would feel better. That was pretty tricky. It was also very important to know how to find your way back to the wagon train if you got lost out on the prairie. The trail was usually close to the river, so you would be safe if you could find your way to the water. If you had gone out exploring on the prairie, it wasn't always easy to see the river. Although the land looked flat, the rivers usually ran in a valley. Sometimes the sides of the river banks were 60 feet high. The secret to following was to follow the buffalo tracks. The buffalo walked in a single file, many rows of them, to the river to drink. They used the same paths over and over again, so their paths were sometimes 10 inches deep and a foot wide. You couldn't miss them. The pioneers also learned how to leave messages on the trail for wagons coming after them. Sometimes notes were written on the bones of cattle that had died along the way. Another way to leave messages was to cut a slit in a stick, put a piece of paper with your message on it into the slit, and stand the stick in the ground near the trail so that the next wagon train could see it. Sometimes messages told you that a cow had been lost, and would you please watch to see if you could find it. Other notes might tell you that there was a good place to camp up ahead. Sometimes notes just sent greetings to friends. So you can see they would find the buffalo trails and follow it down to the river. They could get water. We're almost done. Do you remember the other tricks of the trail described in this book? How would you make butter while the wagon is moving? How do you keep eggs from breaking as you ride over bumpy trails? How do you dry meat to make it last a long time? How would you make firewood without wood? How do we know what it was like to travel west in a covered wagon? We know a lot about the wagon trains from diaries that the pioneers wrote. When you keep a diary, you try to write down what happens every day. You write about what you see and think. You write down everything that interests you, including what other people say and do. So here's a little girl writing in her diary. Many diaries were written by grown-ups, but sometimes children wrote them too. Helen Scott was 11 years old when she traveled west in a covered wagon, and she kept a diary. Jesse Applegate, who was also young when his family went to Oregon, he didn't write a diary then, but he wrote about the trip when he grew up. One thing he remembered was how big the prairie dog cities were. He said he thought some seemed as great as New York City. And Helen Carpenter was 19 years old when she went west and wrote in her diary that buffalo meat was delicious. You can learn a lot about the Oregon Trail from reading diaries because each person wrote about different things. If you were a shoemaker, you might write about how the Indians made moccasins. If you were a doctor, you might name all the plants you saw that would make good medicines. If your wagon wheel broke, you might write about how to make a new one. What do you think you would have written about? Is there anything left of the old Oregon Trail? Today, you can drive on highways over much of the old Oregon Trail. Along the way, you can see some of the places you have read about in this book. In fact, at many of the places, the old Oregon Trail, you can stand in the wagon ruts made by the covered wagons that went west so many years ago. And if you ever get out to the Whitman Mission, you can actually walk on part of the real Oregon Trail, and it has these ruts right here where the wagons traveled over. It's very cool. All right, my friends, we have finished. Our next video will be about fudge. Can't wait.